Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, AI Developments Industry, Friday, July 24. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Let me begin with a small story that once you see it, you cannot stop seeing everywhere. Picture an executive at a company with more than $2 billion in annual revenue. This person has just delivered a technical strategy, a real document, with real consequences for thousands of employees, built entirely around artificial intelligence. And then, in a candid moment, this same executive confesses that they have never once used any of these tools. Not a single query, not an afternoon's tinkering. The strategy exists, the experience does not. Now the tempting reading is the obvious one, that this is simple hypocrisy or laziness or the familiar spectacle of a leader out of their depth. But I'd like to propose something more unsettling, because the more interesting pattern is not about that one person. It's about what happens next, down the chain, when nobody dares to break the spell. Consider the vendor's dilemma. A salesperson knows perfectly well that a customer's executive is making absurd claims, 100 times more productive, that sort of thing. And the salesperson could, in principle, gently correct the record. But if they do, they don't merely lose a talking point. They puncture the credibility of the very executive who is championing their product inside the client's organization. To tell the truth is to commit an act of heresy against your own customer's belief system, and heresy gets contracts cancelled. So the truth stays buried, not because everyone is deceived, but because everyone is entangled. Each party's exaggeration becomes load-bearing for the next party's exaggeration. The falsehood is not a bug in the system. It is the mortar holding the system together. That is the non-obvious insight I want you to carry through the rest of the hour. The current state of the field is not best described as a gap between hype and reality. That framing is far too comfortable. It is better described as an incentive structure in which nobody who knows better is permitted to say so. And that structure is remarkably stable, because breaking it is always someone's personal catastrophe and never anyone's personal reward. Here's why this matters so much right now. Because if you set the theater aside, the strategies written by people who have never touched the tools, the leaderboards measuring token consumption as though tokens were the product rather than a cost, something genuinely extraordinary is happening in the quiet corners. Consider the runtime beneath one of the most widely used coding assistants, quietly rewritten from one language into another and shipped to millions of machines. Startup got 10% faster. Barely anyone noticed. Boring, as the author put it, is good. Or consider an entire web browser compiled into a form that runs inside another browser, a genuinely absurd feat of engineering, assembled for roughly $25,000 of model usage on a subscription plan. Or small tool that runs a database engine inside a browser to explain query plans, built almost casually to scratch a personal itch. Do you see the split? There are two economies operating simultaneously under the same banner. In the first, the loud one, value is asserted, 100-fold transformational revolutionary, and the assertion is protected from scrutiny by the social cost of doubt. In the second, the quiet one, value is demonstrated, 10% faster, a tool that didn't exist yesterday, a task that would have taken a fortnight now taking an afternoon. And the tragedy of the moment is that the loud economy is actively drowning out our ability to perceive the quiet one. The mania is not merely embarrassing. It is epistemically expensive. It makes it harder to know what is actually true about tools that are, in genuine and measurable ways, remarkable. You can watch the two economies collide in the marketplace itself. A leading lab plans to pull its best model out of subscription plans, driven by real anxiety about compute capacity, a hard, physical constraint, gallons of water and gigawatts of power. And then a competitor ships something good enough that the plan becomes untenable overnight, and the model comes back, with an apology in the form of account credit. Reality asserts itself through competition and cost, even as the rhetoric floats free above it. Meanwhile, note the sobering figure from the enterprise trenches. More than half of surveyed organizations have already had a security incident with an autonomous agent, real access, real systems, controls lagging badly behind ambition. So here is the argument I want to build across our time together. First, this hour, the field stands at a peculiar crossroads where genuine, boring, useful capability is being obscured by a self-reinforcing mania that punishes honesty. Then we'll examine what that mania is doing to the institutions meant to govern all this. The red lines, the review bodies, the frameworks that get quietly defanged. And finally, we'll ask the harder question, what a sane relationship with these tools would actually look like if we could only lower the volume enough to hear ourselves think. Let's begin. There's a story we tell ourselves about technology, and it goes something like this. The important thing is the machine. Build a better engine, a faster chip, a cleverer model, and the world reshapes itself around the artifact. It's a comforting story because it's tidy. It puts the drama in the laboratory. But if you spend any time watching how these AI systems actually enter the world, how they land inside real companies, real governments, real teams of nervous people trying to keep their jobs, you notice something rather different. The deep current beneath all this noise is not really about the machines at all. It's about incentives. It's about who is permitted to say what is true. Consider the executive who produces a technical strategy for an organization with $2 billion in revenue, a strategy built entirely around artificial intelligence, and who has, we're told, never once in their life opened one of these tools. Now, the easy reaction is to laugh, and it is funny. But sit with it a moment longer, and the laughter curdles into something more disquieting, because that executive is not stupid. That executive is responding, quite rationally, to the incentives placed in front of them. The reward for confident enthusiasm is enormous. The penalty for measured skepticism is career-shaped and immediate. The machine has barely entered the picture. What's driving the decision is a social gradient, a slope down which every ambitious person is quietly rolling. And here is the detail I find genuinely remarkable. There was an account of a vendor, a company selling these systems, whose own people privately believed the productivity claims being made were absurd. Customers were boasting of hundredfold improvements, and yet the vendor could not contradict them, not because the sales material demanded it, but because to say, no, that gain isn't plausible, would humiliate the customer's executive who had staked his credibility on it. Correcting the falsehood became an act of aggression. Telling the truth risked cancelling the contract, so the falsehood was permitted to stand not through conspiracy, but through a chain of people each protecting the person above them. Honesty had been priced out of the room. That is the deep current, not a technology that lies to us, but an economy of belief in which lying has become the cheaper option and truth-telling carries a tariff nobody wants to pay. And once you see it everywhere. You see the engineer quietly instructing a model to rewrite an entire codebase in a different language, not because it serves the product, but because a leaderboard is counting tokens, and being seen to consume the tokens is now the job. The activity has detached from the purpose. What's measured is enthusiasm, and so enthusiasm is what gets manufactured. Now I want to be scrupulously fair here, because the corpus offers a corrective, and it matters. Somewhere beneath the mania, real things are being built, and they are boring, and boring is precisely the point. A widely used coding assistant quietly shipped a runtime rewritten in a system's language. Startup got 10% faster. Barely anyone noticed. There was no announcement worthy of the term, no hundredfold anything. Just a modest, verifiable improvement that people could inspect for themselves by rummaging through the binary. That, I'd suggest, is what genuine progress actually looks like: unglamorous, measurable, and almost embarrassingly quiet. It sits in stark contrast to the theater happening 2 floors up in the executive suite, so we have 2 currents running in opposite directions. Down at the level of the work, people are making cautious, checkable claims and shipping small true things. Up at the level of decision-making, people are making grand, uncheckable claims and rewarding one another for the grandeur. The gap between those 2 layers is where the danger lives. It's the same gap that shows up when more than half of surveyed enterprises admit their AI agents have already caused a security incident or a near miss, while cheerfully continuing to let those agents share credentials. The story being told upstairs, agents are transforming everything, cannot afford to be interrupted by the story being lived downstairs. The controls haven't caught up. The optimism has become load-bearing, and load-bearing optimism is a structure you cannot inspect without bringing it down. What all this suggests is that the real scarce resource in this moment is not compute, and it's not talent, and it's not data. It's the willingness to be unimpressive in public. To say this took $25,000 of tokens and produced something absurdly cool but of no obvious commercial value. To say, I don't fully understand this output, approach with caution. To say the gains are real but modest. Those are the sentences that keep an institution honest, and they are exactly the sentences the current incentives punish. The machines, for all their strangeness, are not the thing eviscerating our judgment. We are doing that ourselves, one flattering silence at a time, and no model, however capable, can be trusted to fix a problem we've arranged so carefully not to name. So here we are at the end of the thread, and it falls to me to ask the awkward question that closes every good survey of a busy fortnight. What does all this actually mean? Not the individual headlines, which are diverting enough, but the shape they make when you stack them one atop the other and squint. Let me start with the piece of reporting that ought to unsettle anyone with a fiduciary bone in their body. There is an account making the rounds, spicy, anonymous, entirely plausible, of an executive who produced a technical strategy for an organization with over $2 billion in revenue, a strategy built entirely around artificial intelligence, having never once used any such tool in his life. And the detail that lingers is not the ignorance itself. Ignorance is survivable. The detail that lingers is the account of a vendor who couldn't tell the truth to a customer because the customer's own executive had publicly promised a 100-fold productivity gain, and to contradict that promise was to be perceived not as candid but as heretical, an attack that might get a contract cancelled. That is the second-order implication worth watching. We have built a market where honesty is priced as insubordination, where the incentive gradients all point away from anyone saying that number is made up. When flattery becomes the price of the enterprise deal, the information that decision-makers most need to hear is precisely the information no one is paid to deliver. Hold that thought against a second cluster of stories, because the contrast is instructive. While executives were producing AI strategies they hadn't tested, actual engineers were quietly rewriting a JavaScript runtime in Rust, shipping it across millions of devices, and this is the phrase I keep returning to barely anyone noticed. Boring is good. A 10% faster startup on Linux. That's it. That's the whole headline. And somebody rebuilt a browser inside another browser for the sport of it, funded by $25,000 of tokens. The lesson here is that the real productivity is happening in the least glamorous rooms, measured in single-digit percentages and startup times, entirely disconnected from the 100x rhetoric floating above it. Watch that gap between the ground truth and the pitch deck. The wider it grows, the more violent the eventual correction. Now, the third thing to watch, and this one is genuinely new. There is a report across 100-odd enterprises that more than half have already had a confirmed security incident or near miss involving an AI agent, and that most of them still let those agents share credentials. Sit with that. We are handing autonomous software real access to real systems faster than we are building the controls to contain it. This is the predictable consequence of the mania I just described. When your executive has promised a 100-fold gain, you do not pause to build a permissions model. You deploy. The incident rate is simply the invoice arriving for enthusiasm purchased on credit. So watch the security posture, not the capability demos. The question is never, can the agent do it? But what else can the agent do that you didn't ask for? Fourth thread is subtler, and I find it the most quietly hopeful. Underneath all the froth, serious people are asking whether these systems can be made governable at all, through red lines that hold under commercial pressure, through funds pointed at the neglected corner of alignment research, through the old and rather beautiful analogy that we align our children not by controlling their every move, but by cultivating in them an internal sense of what is expected. Endogenous alignment, someone called it. We don't police adults, we trust them to police themselves. The open question, the one to watch across the next few years, is whether we are building systems that can be trusted in that grown-up way, or whether we are building things that require a warden forever. And notice how thin the funding is on that side of the ledger. Nearly all the money goes to evaluation, to control, to watching the thing, and almost none to the harder problem of making the thing actually want the right outcomes. So what does it all mean? I'd put it like this. We are living through a period in which the language has decoupled from the reality. The rhetoric promises transformation. The engineering delivers modest, real, unglamorous gains. The security bill is already coming due. And the deepest question, can these things be trusted without a leash, remains underfunded and largely unanswered. The signal to watch is the reconvergence. At some point, the pitch and the ground truth must meet again, and when they do, the people who were paid to be honest all along will suddenly become very valuable indeed. Boring, as our Rust enthusiast said, is good. I'd go further. Boring is the sound of someone telling you the truth. Cultivate a taste for it. And on that note, thank you for listening. We'll be here watching the signal when next you are. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.